The hall was cold and gray-like. Everything else on prime. Sergeant stood at attention with 39 other recruits, her boots planted firmly on the metal floor. She was the smallest person in the room. She was also the only human. Around her stood creatures of every shape and size. They towered at 8 ft tall, their blue skin thick as armor that had 4 arms, each perfect for operating complex weapons. They moved in perfect unison, their hive mind giving them coordination no other species could match. And then there was 56, brown skin, black hair, pulled back in a tight bun, just a human, from a small planet on the edge of known space. Commander Han walked slowly in front of the recruits. He was a tall and thin with scales that shifted color with his mood. Right now they were a deep purple, which meant he was serious. His yellow eyes moved across each recruit before stopping on for just a moment. Longer than the others. You have trained for 11 months, he said, his voice echoing through the hall. You have learned to fight, you have learned to think, you have learned to work together, but none of that matters if you cannot survive. He pressed a button on his wrist device. A hologram appeared in the center of the room, showing a planet covered in green and blue and brown. Felt her heart skip. She knew that planet. She had grown up on that planet. This is the Earth simulation. Han continued. 200 years ago, Coalition scientists studied the most dangerous planet ever discovered. They found a world of extremes, deserts that could cook you alive, jungles filled with poison and predators, oceans that could swallow entire fleets, weather that changed without warning, and worst of all, they found the creatures that lived there. The hologram changed to show various Earth animals, lions, sharks, snakes, bears. The alien recruits shifted nervously. The scientists took everything they learned and built this simulation. It combines the worst elements of Earth into a single 72-hour scenario. Extreme temperatures, hostile wildlife, disease, and enemy combatants, using the tactics that Earth's dominant species developed over thousands of years of constant warfare. And let that sink in before continuing. No recruit has ever completed the Earth simulation. The current record is 4 hours and 23 minutes. You are not expected to pass. You are expected to survive as long as you can. Your performance will determine your final ranking and assignment. A recruit raised his massive hand. Commander, if no one has ever passed, why do we still use it? Because it shows us who you really are, Han answered. When everything goes wrong, when death is certain, what do you do? Do you panic? Do you give up? Or do you keep fighting? He paused. The simulation will begin in 1 hour. Use this time to prepare yourselves mentally. Physical preparation will not help you. The recruits were dismissed. They gathered in small groups, talking nervously about what they had just learned. Stood alone by the window, looking out at the alien sky. A recruit walked up to her. His name was, and he had been one of the few aliens willing to talk to her during training. You look calm, he said, using 2 of his arms to gesture at her relaxed posture. I am calm, replied the Earth simulation is based on your does that not worry you? Turned to look at him. There was something in her eyes that had never seen before. It was not fear. It was not confidence either. It was something older, something deeper. I grew up in the Amazon basin, she said quietly. My mother ran a research station in the jungle. By the time I was 8. I could identify 200 species of snake. By their tracks alone, 50 of them were venomous. Blinked his 4 eyes. When I was 12, my family moved to the Saharan reclamation zone. My father was helping to rebuild. After the water wars, I spent my teenage years learning to survive in the desert. How to find water, how to travel at night, how to read the sand. That sounds difficult, Sid smiled, but there was no humor in it. When I was 17, I joined the Emergency Response Corps. Hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, I have seen everything Earth can do to try to kill people. She turned back to the window. The coalition built a simulation of my home and called it impossible. They studied Earth from orbit. They watch from safe distances. They have no idea what it really means to. There did not know what to say. He had never heard speak so much at once. He had never seen that look in anyone's eyes before. 1 hour later, the recruits gathered in the simulation chamber. 40 pods stood in rows, each one designed to create a perfect virtual environment. Once inside, your body would stay safely in the pod while your mind experienced the simulation. If you died in the simulation, you would wake up in the pod. If you quit, you simply had to say so. Climbed into her pod and laid down. The lid closed over her with a soft hiss. For a moment, everything was dark and silent. Then the world changed. She opened her eyes and found herself standing in a jungle. The heat hit her immediately, thick and wet like a blanket soaked in warm water. The sounds came next: birds screaming in the canopy, insects buzzing everywhere, something large moving through the undergrowth nearby. Took a deep breath. The smell was overwhelming. Rotting plants, flowers, earth, real earth, or at least what the simulation thought Earth smelled like. She checked herself. Basic uniform, no weapons, no supplies. Just her body and her mind. That was more than enough. Most recruits would panic right now. They would run or freeze or try to find other recruits. Did none of those things. She stood perfectly still and listened. The jungle spoke to those who knew how to hear it. The birds told her where the predators were. The insects told her about the water sources. The direction of the wind told her about the weather coming. She started walking, not running, not rushing, just walking with purpose. She knew exactly where she needed to go. The observation room. Commander Han watched her bio signs on his screen. Heart rate elevated but steady. Stress hormones minimal. Brain activity focused. Interesting, he muttered. Beside him, a junior instructor looked at the same data. She is the human. Yes, the one from Earth. Han nodded slowly. Is that not unfair, testing her with a simulation of her own planet? The commander did not answer right away. He watched as found a stream within 20 minutes, something that usually took recruits hours if they found one at all. He watched as she tested the water with leaves, checking for certain chemicals, the way her ancestors had done for thousands of years. We built this simulation because Earth was the most dangerous planet we had ever seen, Han finally said. We made it impossible because we believed no species could survive what Earth throws at its inhabitants. He turned to the junior instructor with a strange expression. It never occurred to anyone that a child of Earth might one day take the test. On the screens, other recruits were already struggling. One had collapsed from the heat. 2 had walked straight into a predator zone. I was showing signs of severe panic and walked calmly through The jungle building shelter before the sun began to set, already preparing for the night that was coming. The Earth simulation had found its first worthy opponent. The first night was the hardest for most recruits. Simulation dropped the temperature by 40 degrees once the sun went down. The jungle came alive with new sound, screams and howls, and the soft padding of hunters searching for prey sat inside the shelter she had built. It was simple but effective. A frame of branches covered with large leaves to keep out the rain. That would come at midnight. She knew it would rain because she had seen the clouds building in the west and felt the change in air pressure. The jungle told you everything if you paid attention. She had started a small fire using friction. It took her 15 minutes. Recruit had tried the same thing and given up after 2 hours, not understanding why the wood would not catch. You needed the right wood. You needed to understand how fire worked. Had known this since she was 6 years old. The fire served 3 purposes. It kept her warm, it kept the predators away, and it let her cook the roots and insects she had gathered before dark. They tasted terrible, but they would keep her alive. In the observation room, the screen showed disaster after disaster. Recruit 17 had been attacked by a simulated snake and died of poison. Within minutes, Recruit 23 had drunk bad water and was now suffering from severe cramps. Recruit 8 had simply given up and said the words that ended the simulation. How many are left? Commander Han asked. 14 active, the junior instructor replied. 9 have died in simulation. 17 have quit, and the human, the instructor pulled up screen, stable, all biosigns normal. She is sleeping. Han leaned forward, sleeping. Yes, Commander, she appears to have set some kind of alert system around her camp, strings connected to objects that will make noise if disturbed. She is sleeping in 4-hour shifts. The commander said nothing. He had never seen a recruit sleep during the first night. Most were too terrified to close their eyes. Woke before dawn. She put out her fire carefully, covering the ashes so they would not give away her position. Then she started walking again. Simulation shifted the environment after the first 12 hours. The jungle gradually became thinner. The air became drier. By noon, found herself at the edge of a desert that stretched to the horizon. This was where most recruits died. The transition was too much for them. Their bodies had just adapted to the humidity. When suddenly they had to deal with heat and dryness, they made mistakes. They walked during the hottest hours. They did not protect their heads. They did not ration water, stopped at the edge of the jungle and waited. She spent the hottest part of the day in the shade of the last trees. She wore a covering for her head from leaves. She searched the transition zone for plants that stored water in their roots. By the time the sun began to lower, she had gathered enough supplies for the crossing. Then she walked. The desert at night was cold and beautiful. Stars filled the sky, more than the simulation should have known to include. Wondered if the coalition scientists had actually visited Earth or if they had just studied it from space. They had gotten so many details right, but they had missed the feeling of it, the way the sand talked under your feet, the way the stars seemed close enough to touch. She walked until dawn, then found a rocky outcrop that provided shade. She dug into the sand at the base until she found cooler earth. She buried herself partially to conserve water, and slept. Through the day, in the observation room, more screens went dark. Recruit 5 died of heat stroke. Recruit 12 was killed by a predator that had followed from the jungle. Recruit 31 walked in circles until she collapsed. How many now? Hin asked. 6 active, including the human. Time elapsed 31 hours. The commander pulled up file. For the 10th time that day, born in New Santos, Brazil, mother a biologist, father an engineer, education in 3 different climate zones, emergency response certification, no military background before joining the coalition academy. She is not remarkable on paper, Han said. Quietly, her test scores were average. Her physical performance was below several other recruits. Why is she the one surviving? The junior instructor had been thinking about this. Perhaps it is experience. Commander, the other recruits trained for combat. She trained for survival. There is more to it than that, Han replied. Watch her movements. Watch how she makes decisions. There is no hesitation, no doubt. It is as if she has done this before, not trained for it. Done it. On the screen, woke from her day's sleep and began walking again. She moved efficiently, conserving energy, reading the landscape for signs of water and danger. She was not fighting the environment, she was working with it. The simulation threw new challenges at her. A sandstorm came from nowhere, reducing visibility to nothing. Found a rock formation and pressed herself against it, covering her face with her makeshift head covering. She stayed there for 3 hours until the storm passed. When she emerged, she was covered in sand but unharmed. Venomous creatures appeared at night. Drawn by her body heat, avoided them not by running but by understanding. She knew which ones were aggressive and which would leave her alone if she moved. Slowly she had grown up with worse. By hour 40 only remained the last other recruit. Had died from infection after cutting himself on a rock. The coalition's advanced healing technology was disabled in the simulation. In the real test, you had to survive with nothing. Commander Han called in emergency meeting of the academy leadership. We have a situation, he said to the assembled officers. A recruit is about to break the Earth simulation record. Not just break it, destroy it. The human asked Admiral, the academy commandant. She was an elderly. Her scales faded to pale gray. I have been watching. It seems almost unfair. Is it unfair? Another officer asked. She is being tested on her own planet. She knows the environment. That is precisely the point, Han replied. We built this simulation because Earth was terrifying. We made it impossible because we could not imagine any species surviving what Earth produces. But we forgot something. Earth does produce a species that survives it. Humans. The room fell silent. She is not cheating, Han continued. She is demonstrating exactly what the simulation was designed to reveal. When we studied Earth, we saw the dangers, the threats, we measured the extremes. But we did not understand what those things created. We did not understand what living on that planet does to a species. On the main screen, continued walking through the desert. She had found a dried riverbed and was following it, knowing it would eventually lead to water. Her face was burned, her lips were cracked, her body was running on almost nothing, but she kept walking. What do we do? Admiral asked. We watch, Han said. We watch and we learn. Because I believe we are about to see something that changes how the coalition views humanity forever. The combat phase began at hour 48, had just found water, a small spring hidden in a canyon, exactly where the dried riverbed had promised it would be. She was filling her improvised container when she heard the sound, boots on rock, multiple targets moving with discipline. She did not panic, she simply melted into the shadows of the canyon wall and waited. 3 figures appeared above her on the ridge. They were simulated soldiers, designed to replicate the most dangerous fighters Earth had ever produced. They moved like ghosts, communicating with hand signals, scanning for targets with cold efficiency. Recognized the tactics immediately. They were using formations from the Pacific Rim Wars. Her father had taught her about those wars. He had fought in them. He had lost friends in them. He had come home with scars that never fully healed. The soldiers moved on, not seeing her. Pressed against the rocks. Waited 5 full minutes after they disappeared. Before she moved again, patience had kept her ancestors alive for thousands of years. It would keep her alive now. In the observation room, a new group of officers had gathered. Word had spread through the academy that something unprecedented was happening. The screens showed position and the positions of the enemy combatants hunting her. Why is she not fighting? A young officer asked. Commander Han answered without looking away from the screen. Because she does not need to. The objective is survival. Fighting wastes energy and risks injury. She is doing exactly what a human would do. And what is that? Waiting, watching, learning. The commander pointed his path. On the map, she's studying their patrol patterns. She is memorizing their schedules. When she moves, she will know exactly where they are. The young officer frowned. That seems cowardly. An older officer laughed bitterly. That is exactly what we thought when we first encountered humans. We expected them to fight like every other species, head-on confrontations, displays of strength. But humans do not fight like that. They fight like predators. They watch and wait and strike when you least expect. It is not cowardice, it is efficiency. Moved through the canyon network for the next 6 hours. She found food where the soldiers had left garbage. She collected water from condensation on the canyon walls. She built mental maps of every patrol route, every guard position, every blind spot. Then the simulation changed again. The canyon opened into a temperate forest. The temperature dropped, rain began to fall, and the enemy presence increased dramatically. What had been scattered patrols became coordinated search teams. The simulation was pushing harder, trying to force a confrontation. Found a cave and settled in to wait. Rain lasted 12 hours. The temperature dropped until her breath came out in white clouds. Built a small fire deep in the cave where the light would not be visible from outside. She used the time to rest and recover. While she rested, her mind wandered to memories she usually kept locked away. She remembered her grandmother, who had survived the food riots of the 30s. The old woman had taught how to find food anywhere, how to make something from nothing, how to keep going when your body wanted to stop. She remembered her mother, who had stayed calm when a flood destroyed their research station while others panicked. Her mother had organized the evacuation. She had saved 17 people by refusing to give up. She remembered her father quiet and strong, who had come home from the war, changed but not broken. He had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was being afraid and doing what needed to be done. Anyway, this was what the coalition did not understand about humans. They saw a young species from a dangerous planet. They saw average test scores and below average physical performance. They did not see the 10,000 years of survival coded into human genes. They did not see the ancestors who had walked out of Africa with nothing but stone tools. They did not see the generations who had conquered deserts and oceans and frozen wastelands. Earth did not make humans weak. Earth made humans into the most adaptable, stubborn, impossible to kill species the galaxy had ever produced. When the rain stopped, emerged from her cave, the enemy was close now. She could hear them moving through the forest, calling to each other, confident in their numbers. She had a choice. She could keep hiding. She could run, or she could do what her ancestors had done when faced with overwhelming odds. She chose to adapt. For the next several hours became the hunter instead of the hunted. She did not attack directly. She set traps. She led patrols into ambushes against each other. She stole supplies and weapons from enemy camps while they slept. In the observation room, Admiral leaned forward in her seat. What is she doing? Commander Hind smiled for the first time in days. Guerrilla warfare. It is a human specialty. When they cannot win through strength, they win through intelligence. They make the enemy doubt. They make the enemy tired. They make the enemy afraid. On the screen, an enemy patrol walked into one of traps. A simple snare caught one soldier while appeared from the shadows, disabled the other two with quick strikes to vulnerable points, and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. She learned their tactics from the simulation, Han explained. Now she is using those same tactics against them. This is what humans do. They learn, they adapt, they overcome. By hour 60 had reduced the enemy force by half. She was injured now, a deep cut on her arm from a close encounter, but she had managed to bandage it with strips from her uniform. She was tired. She was hungry, but she was still moving. The simulation threw one more surprise at her. The forest gave way to a rocky mountainside. At the top of the mountain, an enemy command post had been established. The remaining soldiers had gathered there, creating a fortified position. Studied the mountain from the tree. The logical choice was to avoid it, to hide until the 72 hours ended. She had nothing to prove. She had already survived longer than anyone in history, but something in her refused to simply survive. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. When you have nothing left, you find out what you are really made of. Started climbing the mountain, fought her every step of the way, climbed through the night using shadows and rock formations for cover. The enemy had sentries posted at regular intervals, but they were looking outward, expecting an assault force. They were not expecting a single human. Climbing the sheer rock face with nothing but her bare hands, her muscles screamed. The cut on her arm had started bleeding again. The cold wind cut through her torn uniform like knives. But she kept climbing. In the observation room, every screen was focused on her position. The academy leadership had been joined by officers from across the coalition. Word had spread beyond Prime. A human was about to do the impossible. She should stop, a medical officer said, studying her biosigns. Her body is at the limit. If she pushes any harder, she risks permanent damage. Commander Han shook his head. She will not stop. You do not understand humans. They do not know how to stop. That is not a strength, the medical officer replied. That is a flaw, is it? Admiral asked. Quietly, she has survived longer than any recruit in our history. She has turned our impossible test into her personal challenge. If pushing past limits is a flaw, then it is a flaw that has kept humanity alive for longer than most species have existed. On the screen, pulled herself onto a narrow ledge. She lay there for a moment, breathing hard, staring up at the stars. Then she rolled over and continued climbing. The simulation threw everything it had left at her. A storm rolled in from nowhere. Rain and wind and lightning transformed the mountain into a death trap. Rocks became slippery. Handholds crumbled. The temperature dropped until ice began forming on the exposed surfaces. Found a small overhang and pressed herself against the rock. She was shaking now, her body trying to generate heat through movement. Hypothermia was setting in. She could feel it in the way. Her thoughts were becoming slow and fuzzy. She remembered a story her father had told her about a soldier in the old wars. The soldier had been trapped behind enemy lines in winter. No food, no shelter, no hope of rescue. He had survived for 3 weeks by refusing to accept that death was an option. The body wants to die, her father had said. It looks for excuses to give up, but the mind can override the body. The mind can force the body to keep going long past what should be possible. That is the human advantage. We are too stubborn to know when we are beaten. Pushed herself back into the storm. She climbed by feel, now her fingers finding holds that her eyes could not see. The wind tried to tear her from the rock face. The rain blinded her. Lightning struck the peak above, so close that she felt her hair stand up from the static. She kept climbing. By hour 70 she reached the final ridge below the enemy command post. She lay in the mud, invisible, the darkness, and studied the fortification above her. 12 soldiers remained. They had built walls and guard towers from the local materials. Search lights swept the approaches. It was a proper military position designed to hold against a much larger force. Had no force she had herself. That would have to be enough. She spent the next 30 minutes watching, learning, understanding. The guards changed every hour. There was a gap of approximately 90 seconds when visibility was reduced. The searchlight pattern had a blind spot on the eastern approach. At hour 71 she moved. She crossed the open ground like a ghost. A lifetime of training and instinct guided her movements. She knew exactly how to place her feet to make no sound. She knew how to use the terrain to stay below the she reached the wall without being detected. The next part was harder. She had to get inside and disable the command post to complete the simulation. Survival was no longer enough. She had decided to win. She found a drainage gap in the wall. It was barely wide enough for her shoulders, but she squeezed through, leaving skin on the rough stones. She emerged inside the compound behind a supply depot and took a moment to assess the situation. The command center was a prefabricated building in the center of the compound. 2 guards stood at the entrance. More patrolled the perimeter. The search lights continued their sweep, picked up a stone and threw it against the far wall. The guards reacted immediately. turning toward the sound, moved in the opposite direction, sliding along the shadows until she reached the command cent's rear wall. There was a ventilation shaft, small but possible. She pulled the cover off and crawled inside. The shaft led her directly above the main operations room. Through the grating, she could see the simulated officers coordinating their forces. They still believed they were hunting her. Somewhere on the mountain, they had no idea she was already inside. Kicked out the grating and dropped into the room. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds. She had studied their weapons, their stances, their reaction times. She had learned from watching them for hours. Now she used everything she had learned. The first officer fell before he could raise his weapon. The second managed to turn before she took his legs out from under him. The third reached for an alarm that she had already disabled by cutting the power line during her entry. When the door burst open and guards rushed in, they found standing in the center of the room every officer was down. The command console was destroyed. The simulation's victory condition had been met. The timer on the wall showed 715,942. 18 seconds to spare. In the observation room, there was absolute silence. Officers from a dozen different species stared at the screens, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Admiral spoke first. Did she just? Yes. Commander Han replied. His scales had shifted to a color no one had ever seen before. It might have been awe. She did not just survive, she won. She beat the Earth simulation. The medical officer was already calling for emergency teams to be ready when the pods opened. Her body is shutting down. She pushed too hard. She will need immediate treatment. She knew that. Han said quietly. She knew what it would cost. She did it anyway. Why? Someone asked. Commander did not have an answer, but he thought he was beginning to understand something about humanity that he had never grasped before. They did not fight because they expected to win. They fought because giving up was simply not in their nature. The simulation ended. The screens went dark, and somewhere in the pod chamber opened her eyes. The pod opened with a soft hiss. Lay still for a moment, her body remembering how to exist in the real world. The simulation had felt so real that the sudden absence of pain was almost disorienting. Her muscles did not ache. Her arm was not cut. She was not freezing or starving or hunted. She was just tired, more tired than she had ever been in her life. Medical staff rushed toward her pod, but she waved them off. She sat up slowly, then swung her legs over the side and stood on her own feet. The room spun for a moment, but she steadied herself against the pod. The chamber was quiet. 38 other recruits were being helped out of their pods by medical teams. Some were crying, some were shaking, some simply stared at nothing, their minds still trapped in the horrors they had experienced. One pod remained empty. Recruit 34, unnamed, had quit before even entering. He stood by the door now, watching with shame in his eyes, walked toward the exit. Her legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. Every step required conscious effort, but she walked on her own because that was what she had always done. Commander Han stood in her path. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. The commander, whose species had been traveling between stars when humans were still learning to use fire, and the human sergeant who had just proven that her Species had something no amount of technology could replicate. How Hin asked, his voice was quiet almost. Reverent, how did you do it considered? The question, there were many answers she could give. She could talk about her training, her experience, her knowledge of Earth's environment. All of those things were true, but they were not the real answer. You built a simulation of my home, she said. You made it hard. Because Earth is hard, but you forgot one thing. What? Earth made us harder. She walked past him and out of the chamber. The news spread through the academy like fire. By the time reached the medical center, crowds had gathered. In the hallways, aliens of every species stared at her as she passed. Some looked curious, some looked afraid. A few looked at her the way prey looks at a predator. She ignored them all. She let the medical staff examine her, confirm that the simulation had not caused any lasting damage, and give her nutrients and fluids. Then she went to her quarters and slept for 14 hours. When she woke, there was a message waiting for her. The academy commandant wanted to see her. Admiral's office was at the top of the main tower. The walls were transparent, showing the alien sky and the sprawling academy campus below. The admiral stood by the window, her aged scales catching the light from two suns. Sergeant, she said without turning around, please sit. Sad, do you know what you have done? I passed the simulation. Finally turned. Her eyes were ancient and sharp. You did far more than that. You showed the entire coalition that everything we believed about humanity was wrong. What did you believe? You were lucky that you survived your planet's dangers by accident, that your admission to the coalition was a political gesture rather than recognition of actual capability. The admiral moved to her desk and sat down. The Earth simulation was created because we feared your species. We saw your planet and wondered how anything could survive there. We studied your history and saw endless war and destruction. We built the simulation as a warning, a reminder of how dangerous your world was. She paused, her scales shifting to a thoughtful gray. But we made a mistake. We assumed the danger was separate from the species. We did not understand that Earth did not happen to contain humans. Earth created humans. Every challenge your planet threw at your ancestors made them stronger, smarter, more adaptable. You are not survivors of Earth. You are products of Earth, and that makes you more dangerous than we ever imagined. Said nothing. She was not sure if this was a compliment or a threat. We have discussed your case extensively. Continued. Some wanted to disqualify your result. They argued that testing a human on an Earth simulation was inherently unfair. Others wanted to retire the simulation entirely. They felt it was pointless now that it had been completed. And what did you decide? We decided that you have taught us something valuable. The simulation stays, your result stands, and humanity's status in the coalition will be reconsidered. 3 months later, stood before a new class of recruits. She wore the uniform of an academy instructor now, the rank insignia freshly applied to her collar. 40 alien faces looked up at her with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. You are here to become soldiers, she said, her voice carrying through the hall. For the next year you will train harder than you have ever trained before. You will learn to fight. You will learn to think. You will learn to survive. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. At the end of your training, you will face the Earth Simulation. It is a 72-hour scenario that combines the most dangerous elements of the most dangerous planet known space no recruit has ever passed. A hand rose in the back of the room. A young, barely old enough to be here. Is it true that you passed it, the human who completed the simulation? Smiled, I did. How is it possible? Because Earth is my home and Earth does not raise children who know how to give up. The room fell silent. 40 aliens looked at the small human woman standing before them and tried to understand what she represented. They saw her size and her simple appearance. They saw a species that had only been traveling between stars for 2 centuries. But some of them, the smart ones, saw something else. They saw 10,000 years of survival. They saw ancestors who had walked out of ice ages and plagues and wars. They saw species that had been forged in the hottest fire the galaxy had ever produced. Any other questions? Asked. No hands rose. Then let us begin. Outside the training hall, Commander Han watched through a window. He had requested to observe the new intake, curious to see how it would handle the role. Beside him, a junior instructor spoke quietly. Do you think any of them will pass the simulation? Perhaps, perhaps not. The simulation was not designed to be passed, but she passed it. Yes. Hand scales shifted to a color that might have been admiration. She did, and that is exactly what humans do. They face the impossible and refuse to accept it. They look at challenges that should destroy them and find ways to overcome them. It is not logic, it is not strength, it is something else. Something we do not have a word for. What do we call it then? Hen watched begin her first lesson, watched her move among the recruits with the confidence of someone who had faced death and walked away. We call it human, he said, and may the gods help anyone who underestimates what that means. Through the window caught his eye for just a moment. She did not smile, she did not wave, she simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement between 2 soldiers who understood each other. Then she turned back to her students and continued teaching them what it meant to survive. The Earth simulation had found its first champion, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again.